So welcome everyone to Edith Wheeler Memorial Library's next in the series of Connecticut Innovation and Industry with Art Gottleib. We are going to talk today about Colt Firearms. So please give a warm welcome to Art Gottleib.
Thank you. So we all said I'm going to go to, you made me co-host, so I'll go to screen share and pull up my slide presentation. And there it is. Okay, can everybody see my slide? I can't hear you, so you have to tell me. All right. So here we go. Yes, that's okay. I got it in the chat room. Thank you. So there's Samual Colt. And, you know, today's program, I wanted to do this sort of in a chronological order, roughly with the different industries that I picked to highlight. And I recognize that that there are probably not at least a few of my audience members today that might be sensitive over the whole notion of firearms in general. So I'll be sensitive to that. And my program today is really about industry, American industry. But since we're talking about guns essentially, and industry and technology, I will also have to talk about, from a sociological standpoint, how guns are part of the American persona, like it or not, good or bad. And I'm not here to take a position on it. I'm just here to talk about it as a reality. And in the northeastern part of our nation where we are, sensitivities about this or certain feelings about it might be different than if you were in a different place in the country, or maybe a different kind of a culture where people grew up around firearms, etc. Now, my background is going to come into play in today's presentation. Okay, and I'll get into that in a minute, and I'll highlight what that is. Samuel Colt, 1814 to 1862, dies in the second year of the American Civil War. And his firearms and his manufactured products are being used extensively around the world at this point. He is already somebody who's made quite a name for himself. And we know him, of course, from Hartford, Connecticut, Colt Firearms, right, which is why he's in today's presentation. All right. So what this is showing is the different river valleys, the different watersheds around at least three of the major rivers that run through Connecticut or inter-Connecticut, right? The Thames, the Connecticut River Valley, of course, and the Housatonic River Valley. And then further west, of course, you've got Norwalk, which is itself a valley, but is not part of our presentation today. Today, I'm focusing on the Connecticut River Valley, and why that becomes so important is I want to put this in context for us. The firearm industry in the period of time between the American Revolutionary War and the American Civil War was the epicenter of our industrial revolution. And that industrial revolution occurred, in this particular case, right here in Connecticut, in the Connecticut River Valley, where many of the major firearms manufacturers actually sprang up, not the least of which was Colt Firearms. And this was the Silicon Valley of its day. Technology, innovation, a concentration of talent and industry and labor, materials, ease of transport because of its access, easy access to the metropolitan center of New York City, and as well as the Atlantic Ocean because of the Long Island Sound. These geographical things made Connecticut really an ideal place. You consider a place like Bridgeport, Connecticut, and how that was a real center of manufacture. For those of you who are from the Bridgeport area or from Bridgeport, you know how that was like ground zero for manufacture and industry in the Northeast. Not exclusively to Bridgeport, but certainly for Connecticut, yes. Right now, here is the Connecticut River Valley going way up there into Canada, as you can see. And the waterways would give, even pre-electricity, you would give you the easy access to a source of energy from a flowing body of water, which could be channeled or dammed into creating potential energy in the form of dropping water, right? In other words, waterfalls and dammed waterfalls. So therefore you take that dammed waterfall and it creates, you're able to turn milling wheels, which is transferred into side of a factory to turn giant mechanisms, etc. You know, so water hydraulic force is used in all of our early industry. Later on, you had the steam revolution, and that was, say, by 1820, we had workable steam engines, etc. And you created a reliable source of energy that was independent from having a source of water that was moving to be able to drive machinery. Now, here's a building, here's Colt's Armory, right? And as it's pictured here from around circa 1905, and Colt had built this huge H-shaped factory with a large building next to it. And he was a hard driving man as far as an employer was concerned. You know, we had 10-hour work days and you got readily fired if you weren't performing in your job. Colt expected everybody to work as hard as he did. And that wasn't always the case, of course. But he did provide recreation and other sorts of things to try to keep morale up. You know, but Colt was a very entrepreneurial guy. Samuel Colt had a bit of P.T. Barnum in him. And Samuel Colt was not always an inventor and an entrepreneur and a businessman. He had worked in various things before. And he liked to be in public showing his wares. His father had a manufacturing plant, and he actually was going around touting people the effects of laughing gas on one's larynx and how it changes your voice in public. You know, he sort of enjoyed a little bit of showmanship. And when he had these products for for his Colt manufactured guns, he went around the world promoting them. It's the famous onion-shaped dome on the top. I wonder how many of you've actually seen that. See it? You know, so even though the factory itself is a little on the dilapidated side, you know, that is a very distinctive top, isn't it? So the point here is that you have now steam engines, early steam engines. And early steam engines, this happens to be something referred to as a one-lunger, and one lung as in lung. And it's a one-piston, one-cylinder steam engine. And the idea is that you can have now a reliable source of that turning flywheel, you see, by the virtue of the fact that you have taken water, fresh water, brought it to a temperature of 212 degrees Fahrenheit at sea level, and then run that steam through a pipe And then you would actually be able to do useful work with that steam, you say, and it wouldn't matter if it was daytime, it wouldn't matter if it was nighttime, it wouldn't matter if it was raining out or if it wasn't, or if the river outside was flowing or in some kind of a lull. You see, this was very, very important, and it changed the history of the world because now you had a reliable source of mechanical force that could be used to drive. You see that flywheel there. What they would do at the end of a factory floor is they would have a large leather strap, and it would be connected to this long flywheel, or I should say drive shaft, through a factory. You see, now if you've ever been in these New England mill towns, some of which are right under our nose here, you know, my wife and I, when speaking of going to the Cape, you know, we stop at some of these old places past Fall River, et cetera, where they have, you know, these outlet stores and things now. And there are all these old mill factory floors. And you can see, I'm looking at, you know, where they used to have these long shafts. And from those shafts, they would have other leather straps that would drive machinery all the way down the floor, you see. So there's a lot of this old industrial history where we live, if you know where to look. See, and here's an example of that. See the picture here? Now this happens to be in an automotive manufacturer plant, but this is just what it would have looked like inside of, say, a Colt. And I'm pretty sure this photograph is from Cadillac Industries. And essentially what you got here are these leather straps that are running all of these different forms of lathes or milling machines. A lathe is a machine that's designed to turn a piece of material, and you can actually make a cylindrical piece of material to a very precise shape. Or if you look at the balustrades on your banister, if they're round, they were turned on a lathe. Now, if you're going to make 1 million of those and they have to be exactly the same, that's pretty much what we're talking about here today. The whole point of this is that you're mass manufacturing something. Right now, the greatest example that people have of something being mass manufactured, okay, and don't worry, I'm going to get to Samuel Colt, right, is, of course, Henry Ford's Model T. Now, Henry Ford was known for his, to have invented the assembly line process, right? And here you're showing the chassis of Model Ts, and then the bodies are brought over and they're dropped onto the chassis in an assembly line fashion. Every vehicle is assembled the same way, and in the same order, the same sequence, right? So it takes away from the notion that you have to have one craftsman there, you know, when he's building the whole thing from scratch himself, right? You got one guy and his job to put this bolt in and this bolt in, that's it. And then the car moves along, the next car comes in, and this guy's job is to put this bolt in and that bolt in, that's it. And then you move along. Now, here is some of the subcomponents, right? And I'm starting off with something that people might be more familiar with. That's why I'm starting off with this, because it's completely analogous to what we're talking about with the manufacture of a firearm. Here's some sub-assemblies of a Model T, right? There's the steering column. The steering column has been assembled to the firewall, and then the steering wheel has been assembled to the steering column, you see? And then that entire thing is a sub-assembly, is then bolted to the car, which then winds up here in this previous photograph in a more sophisticated level of manufacture where the body is finally put on. Now, it is a misnomer, it is wrong that Henry Ford invented the assembly line process. Okay, that is usually what he's touted for. The person who assembled mass manufacture was way before that. And that primarily, that person is Samuel Colt. And Samuel Colt, in the manufacture of handguns and rifles, was the one who actually put into practice manufacturing individual parts to the same exact specification In other words, the same size and same fit, where you could take any part of a certain function and put it in any gun and it will all work. See, now this sounds ridiculously obvious at the moment, but if you know anything about the history of mechanical things, that was a brand new concept. And when Samuel Colt actually brought that forward into the manufacturing world, it was very new. And it changed everything. You see, so here is a person, a woman in this case, and this is during a war industry, you know, like a Rosie the Riveter kind of a person. And she is actually working on a lathe. And what she's doing there is she's taking a piece of material that has been lathed to a certain size, right? And what she's doing is she's checking it with a tool called a micrometer. And a micrometer, I have one here from my own kit. You can see that. The micrometer, we call them mics, right? You see why. And so now here you've got the ability to constantly check your work and make sure that it's the right size and that it's uniform along its length, if that's the case. And the micrometer can measure a difference in thickness to 1/1000th of an inch. Okay, so depending on the tolerance of what you're working, when I was working as a machinist, we were having tolerances. It was typically, if your part was within 0.003 of an inch, then you were fine, right? And you know, so this is stuff that has a long legacy for me also, this type of thing. Here's a tiny mic that I found in a like a tag sale. It's a smaller one. And these are heirloom tools. These things have a feel and a function that is, if you like mechanical things, it's a real turn on. And it's just beautiful. It's a beautifully made, fine piece of precision equipment. And the reason why I'm lingering with this kind of enthusiasm with this is not just because I'm enthusiastic about it, which I am, but the point is that a gun, whether you love them or you hate them, is a fine piece of precision equipment that people who like fine pieces of precision equipment can't help but appreciate, despite the fact that guns have a certain purpose, which may be lethal in nature. Okay, I understand that. Okay. Here is a Rosie the Riveter type of a woman during World War II, and she is using techniques that were pioneered essentially by Samuel Colt in his manufacture. In this particular case, it's very sophisticated World War II technology, where you have a, like for instance, one of our high-flying fast airplanes, it has a turbocharger on it, or a supercharger, right? Or sometimes both. And you have to have these are two impellers, and they have to be perfectly machined, perfectly balanced. They have to be spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute in perfect vibration-free rotation. You see, and that is what she's using up here. She's using a tool, see if you can see my arrow, called a dial indicator. And what she's doing, she's measuring the run out as the thing is rotated to make sure it's running true. Okay. And even your car tires have to be done this way. It may not seem like it, or if you don't know anything about cars and mechanical things, your tires and the wheels on them have to be perfectly round, and they have to be perfectly balanced, or else your car is going to shimmy and shake all the way down the road, right? So here is one of Colt's early manufacture, right? This is an 1848, something called a Dragoon, right? And what Colt did here was he manufactured a repeating weapon, right? And what a repeating weapon means is that it is a gun that actually has the capacity to fire more than one shot. You see, now that is something that was absolutely groundbreaking in the form and the function of firearm history. You see, because if you remember, like if you've ever seen a Revolutionary War picture or reenactment, you have one shot and with this big flintlock thing that makes this big spark and sets off the black powder. And then this ball comes flying out at the end of the musket. And then when you're done, you got to like crouch down because your enemy knows, your opponent knows that now you're basically helpless until you've loaded your next round manually by hand through the muzzle. You see, so as things evolved, one of the biggest innovations in 1848, right, is you have a handgun actually that you don't have to like, you know, ram from the muzzle. You know, you can actually load it from the breech in a revolving fashion. So you've got several shots before you actually have to like reload the whole thing. And that made a big difference. The Dragoon refers to the nature that the specifications for this gun were as it had to be used by people who were riding a horse, the Dragoons, see? And there was a matter of luck involved in all of this. I mean, some of Samuel Colt's earlier designs were unreliable. He tried to get contracts from the Army. And the one of the Texas Rangers named Walker had, okay, I need some help. Whoever's coughing, I want you to turn your mic off, okay? Thank you. So you had this fellow named Walker who was part of the Texas Rangers. Back in those days was a valid volunteer outfit. And he gave Colt some advice about how to, you know, make a better handgun. And you had this gun that wound up being the Colt Walker revolver. And it was one of the first guns like this one that became widely popularized out in our country, which was moving westward before the Civil War, right? Those of you who have been with me for our Civil War series, you know how important a period of time that was and how firearms were really kind of like the, you know, you were making your law as you were going along, right? You know, Colt started off in Paterson, New Jersey, and he actually wound up going, he had to, what in those days would have been called bankrupt, you see, and they sold all the materials. He had to sell the entire stock, the entire equipment from his factory back in Paterson. And it wasn't until later on where he had the chance to make more handguns, right? He had to run out and he made himself famous and reinvented himself all over again. And here's a picture, or really a drawing, of the factory that is in West Hartford, the one with the onion dome on the top, right? And that's the Connecticut River in the foreground. And so now you have modern Colt manufacturing. Now, Colt was using techniques, like I told you, that were different than what everybody else was doing. Colt was making precision parts where every single sub part to the gun was exactly the same. Nobody had ever done that before, right? And you have to have machine tools to do that, okay? So all of these sub-assemblies, like in this advertisement over here, right? So you've got the frame of the weapon, you've got the revolving cartridge here, you see it, the barrel, right? That's what this type of guns are referred to as revolvers, right? You've got, you know, other parts of the gun stock in the barrel, right? Another thing for Colt was that he was a manufacturer where they were manufacturing all of these parts under one roof by the same designers, you see, and that's where we get the terminology that you can actually get your gun manufactured at Colt, lock, stock, and barrel, you see. Now we still have that term today. It's still part of rhetoric. Well, you know, it's the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. It literally goes right back to here. Before Colt, you had these European style, these Giuseppe Pinocchio guys. You know, who was the guy who carved Pinocchio, right? And you had this one craftsman who would sit there in front of a workbench, and they would literally fashion out of materials a piece of machinery like this gun, you see? And it would be hand fit together, and every single part that went into the other part had to be filed down and made to fit the other part of this gun, right? The screws had to be manufactured, and then the threads were cut on the screws. I mean, everything was unique to this specific gun, right? So that means that if you broke apart a part in this gun, you couldn't just take another part from another gun because it wouldn't fit, because every single gun was made just to fit itself, so to speak, right? The revolution that Colt introduced was the fact that every single one of these parts was manufactured to the same tight, specific tolerances. So no matter what gun you took apart, you could interchange it with other parts from other guns. In between the time where Colt went out of business, if you will, in Patterson, and the time that he reopened his business in Hartford, Colt went abroad. He went over to Europe, and he was a real salesman, this guy. And he would go to one nation and he would say, well, you know what, if I were you, I would buy like 10,000 of my new guns. You know why? Because your opponent, who generally speaking you're going to be at war with, he just bought 10,000 of my guns. And if you don't want to be behind the eight ball, so to speak, you better make sure that you can match his firepower. Now, as it turned out, he lied to both sides. Okay, but that was Colt. And he sold a lot of guns to Europeans that way. He actually opened up a factory in London. And he was manufacturing guns in Great Britain for a while, you see. But the thing is that the old world craftsmen didn't like him, right? The Europeans didn't like him, not because they didn't like Samuel Colt. They didn't like what he represented. What he represented, and this is important from a sociological standpoint, he represented this American kind of cheapening of culture, right? In the same way that if I was to go to a fine French restaurant in Paris and I told them that I like McDonald's hamburgers, it might upset somebody, you see, because McDonald's hamburgers represents this mass-produced, soulless thing, whereas that delicious French meal that I was about to eat at this restaurant was made by craftsmen who were specifically putting their intention into the culinary excellence of my meal, you see? And where the United States started getting that negative reputation, if you will, of just mass producing things without people who even need any kind of skill to do it, that started right here. I mean, if you could create a manufacturing process where the average person could run a machine, and the average person who learned how to use a micrometer could manufacture a part, you don't need the skilled craftsmen of yore, you see? And this is something that still carries with us today as far as this difference of manufacture, right? And what it represents in society. Here is one pair of guns, right, that were made for the United States military, right? It's the Colt Navy on the top, and there's the Army version on the bottom. Now, I really don't know what the difference between these two weapons are, okay? So I hope you'll forgive me with that. Yeah, well, I don't see it. So I'm sure if I dug into this, I'd find out fast enough. But, you know, like it or not, firearms have a certain balance, a certain beauty, and they're manufactured by people, at least back then, who really cared about what they were making. I mean, you can make something that would shoot a bullet out of a barrel that would probably be pretty ugly. But Colt Firearms, like many other manufacturers, I mean, they had a certain beauty to them. And it's kind of like the love affair that Americans always have with cars, in a sense. You know, I mean, you didn't have to have cars that were like really stylish, but people like cars that are stylish. You see, they like things that represent, I don't know, maybe have you're making an external statement about yourself in some fashion. You see, you know, you've all bought a car or own a car or bought something at least that where you bought one instead of this one because you like this one more than that one. We're not completely rational creatures, right? So anyhow, the United States military is now in complete conjunction with private manufacturing, which is another one of our American legacies, whether it be Colt or anybody else, whether it be Colt or present day Raytheon or, you know, McDonnell Douglas aircraft or Boeing aircraft or, you know, any of the major manufacturers. I just did a program on Sikorsky, and we will be doing it in this program as well. You know, but every one of these guns here, the thing is, I'll give you an example. When Colt was in Europe, right, and he was had just closed his Patterson plant. He was at some big exposition in England, like a World's Fair, of all these latest techniques. And, you know, the late 19th century was an incredible time. The late 19th century was like, I would say, probably like the 1990s, 2000s here in our country, as far as computers were concerned. You see, you know, everything was very revolutionary, very forward thinking, very modern. And what Colt did to impress people and got governments who were there to actually purchase his firearms, even though he didn't have a factory at the moment, is he would take like 10 of his guns. Actually, I think it was 9 of his guns, and they were all exactly the same. And what he would do is he would have a demonstration where he would show that every single one of those guns was operable. You see? And then he would have his a couple of crew people come over, and they would break down, they would field strip the guns right on the table. Right, they would take the barrels off. They would take the drums off the cylinders. They would take out the screws. They would take out the springs and all of the little pins and gadgets and these little levers called pawls. They would take them all out until it was just a pile of parts. And then they took the pile of parts and they put it in this sack, and they shook up the sack, and then they dumped out the parts back on the table to demonstrate that all of these parts were absolutely no tricks, completely interchanged and mixed matched, you see? And then those same crew people would put the guns back together, which were obviously parts that must have been in another gun 2 minutes ago. And then after all of the guns were reassembled, then he would actually demonstrate that all 9 guns operated perfectly once again. Now, this may now sound like much to you and me, but that was absolutely groundbreaking and revolutionary. If you consider reliability, if you consider the need for replacement parts, something that in the military we used to call serviceability, right? This was a big, big deal. Now, some of the examples today, I mean, it's, you know, I do a lot of mechanical work. The legacy in my own family is one of machinery like this. You know, I grew up in a locksmith shop, and my father owned a hardware store, but they were locksmiths. My uncle was a locksmith. My grandfather was a locksmith. My father was a locksmith. My older brother was, you know, working with locks. And locks may not mean much to you, right? I don't mean like locks the Nova Scotia variety. I mean locks like door locks, okay? These locks, I actually have some stuff here to show you. This is called a mortise cylinder. Right now, who cares, right? But the thing is that this mortise cylinder, this is an original Lockwood mortise cylinder when these things were still manufactured up in Massachusetts. This is a fine precision piece of machinery with tiny springs and little pins and all sorts of moving little gadgets that drive these little cams and levers. And the entire lock is this fantastic mechanism. And even today, when I smell the scent of light machine oil, it's kind of like for people going back and they smell a Toll House cookie and it reminds them of grandma's kitchen, okay? That's what machinery does to me, because I remember it like clearly from when I was a child. I became a pretty decent locksmith myself, right? I could manufacture, not manufacture, but repair, rekey, cut keys on the milling machines. My father had 5 milling machines for milling parts to manufacture keys, etc. And I grew up as a machinist, essentially. And my first professional training, where I got my first certificate when I was 17 years old, 16 to 17 years old, was as a certified machinist. And then I went out into the field and I operated these enormous milling machines to mill metal parts, right? And it turned out that the factory life wasn't for me. I was a bit of a too much of a free spirit to be there. That's another story for another day. But I appreciate finely tooled mechanical parts. Here's another example, something I just pulled out of my parts shelf. This is a roller bearing, right? If you ever wonder what makes cars roll on their wheels, they're a little bit different today. This one happens to be when I was working on mid-60s performance cars. This might even be an extra bearing from my '69 Corvette. And it is a finely precision milled piece of equipment. Now, the point is that if I needed bearing for my car, okay, I would go on whatever, Rock Auto, and I would order one of these puppies, and it would come in a box, and I would take it out of the box, and assuming it was the right part, I would be able to take the old one off and put the new one on, packed with grease, and it would fit perfectly. Now, the reason it's able to do that is because of what Samuel Colt essentially invented. You see? Everything. One more artifact from the old days. This is when I was a machinist, in machinist school, actually. This is a block of anodized aluminum, right? Black anodized aluminum. And with a computer-aided controlled milling machine, which was still like pretty cutting edge back when I was in school in 1970, whatever it was, 77. This is a finely pieced milled thing, custom made with my initials. You see, ANG, Arthur Neil Gottlieb. You know, so all of this stuff has a huge legacy to me. My father, who's passed just 1 year now, had this always on his desk when I was a kid, and I always wanted it. Now, of course, I've got it because the poor old guy's dead. This is a independent lock company, you see, Ilco, and it's a door. It's a paperweight in the shape of a door check that they used to have on these big heavy doors. And this was something typically the locksmith would install. Now this thing weighs a good like 5 pounds, I'll bet you, right? And it's this beautiful precision made thing. Right, this is something that was to become extraordinarily famous in American history and in American lore, LORE. And this is Colt Single Action Army, right? And there it is. And it looks like a modern revolver because it practically is a modern revolver, you see, practically. And the thing is, back in these days, that A modern revolver uses a regular brass cartridge shell, right? It's like a brass piece with the however many grains of gunpowder in it, and it's got a bullet, a lead bullet pressed into the brass, right? And that's called a cartridge, right? And there's a famous story here. You had this fellow, I think his name was White, if I'm not mistaken, and he came to Samuel Colt and he says, "Why don't we replace these old-fashioned kind of little bags of gunpowder with a ball in it, right? That you have to manually stick in here. And why don't we just make these brass casings with a primer inside with the bullet attached to it? So from the breech, when you slide open the barrel, you can just put these things in there, close it, a firing pin will hit it, you see, and then it'll fire." Well, Samuel Colt, as brilliant as he was an idiot. And he didn't want anybody telling him what to do. So he said no. As a matter of fact, he fired the guy, you see. And then Mr. White went over to Smith and Wesson, and then they patented this idea. And the regular bullet was patented by Smith and Wesson. This not the bullet itself, but the ability to fire said bullet in a certain in the proper barrel like this. That was held by patent by Smith and Wesson for like 20 years. You see, so obviously it was the next great step. But now Colt couldn't use that because it would be a patent infringement. You see, and the same exact thing happened to Thomas Alva Edison, right? Where he had famously Nikola Tesla, who was saying, you know, "Mr. Edison, you've got to go to alternating current because direct current is impractical compared to alternating current." You see, and Nikola Tesla is considered the father of alternating current. And they had a big falling out, Nikola Tesla and Edison was too married to his direct current system, which was nowhere near as efficient for what we use it for as alternating current. And Nikola Tesla finally found himself out on the street, and he got picked up by George Westinghouse, who then patented this whole alternating current system, which of course then completely dominated the market, right? So that's not an atypical story of what happened to Mr. Colt here. This was called the Peacemaker. The famous Colt model 1873. These things are highly sought after, you know, pieces by collectors, etc. I know a lot of different people who have handguns. You know, I myself don't own a handgun. I have never owned a handgun. And I don't think I ever had the hankering to own a handgun. You know, some people do. I don't. It's not to say that I'm a snob and I don't want to shoot one every now and then. And I have. I'm trained by the National Rifle Association, etc. I can walk into any gun shop and rent a gun and spend time in their range. Okay. They come home and smelling like I've been shot out of a cannon, by the way. And but you know, this is a sort of lore of our old West that included these weapons. Here's a second generation Colt single action army. Oh, I spelled army wrong. Look. Here's an advertisement. Colt revolvers acceptable for the reason that for over 70 years they have been absolutely reliability at all times, combined with accuracy and durability, being the first considered consideration in their production, right? And it was true back in the old days when Sam Colt was around and people from his family were around, at least. After he died, it went to his brother-in-law, I think, his wife's brother. Colt had a very tight handle on quality control. You know, that couldn't be said later on after Colt got acquired and merged and acquired and merged and acquired and merged again and again and again. And of course, companies like Colt and other companies thrived during periods of war where the military needed a lot of weapons. And then after war was over, the companies were like, they had to lay off a bunch of people, and if you want to look at this sort of a thing from the standpoint of our politics, you could say that, you have what Eisenhower warned was the military industrial complex. Colt was probably not at the forefront of Eisenhower's thinking, because back then you had all of these people who were manufacturing all of this high tech, space gadgets and airplanes and missiles and that sort of a thing, right? I don't think he was focused on Colt. But here's a fellow over here, who's received this weapon, and he's darn happy to have it. It is an interesting aspect of American history as compared to, say, other contemporary cultures, where there were two big differences up to recent history, at least, between the United States and, say, some of our counterparts in Europe, for instance, right? Maybe France, Great Britain, is that the United States had retained these two things from our revolution, right or wrong, that made us almost like these weird standouts. And those were two things. And it was the love of firearms and the identity of Americanism with these type of weapons, right? And also the adherence to fundamental aspects of religion, right? Primarily Christianity, of course, Protestant especially, you see. And those are two things that really mark the United States as different than other cultures, which I would say still to this day permeates some of the, the vitriol, counter vitriol revolving around guns. And then, of course, since our Constitution has talks about inalienable rights, and in other words, God-given rights. And in our Bill of Rights, you have the Second Amendment. It ties into those first two things I was talking about also. Other nations don't have the Bill of Rights. They don't have the Second Amendment. And they don't have the kind of adherence that at least traditionally Americans had towards reverence to things divine. Now, probably the lasting legacy of Colt is with this weapon right here. And this is the Colt model 1911, okay, where this is the modern semi-automatic gun, you see, and they look exactly the same today as they did before, and there is nothing that compares to this. Everything is a copy. It's like the Chrysler building. It's like, I've seen buildings that people were like, let's rip off the Chrysler building. But you know what? It ain't the Chrysler building, right? So all modern guns, with the exception of a new generations like a Glock, etc., okay? All modern semi-automatic weapons are based or copied essentially on this weapon right here, okay? It is the standard firearm sidearm of the United States military right up until like the turn of the century, right? I'm talking about like 2000, right? Where it was replaced. And, but this was back in the time where Colt was really innovating products. They were innovating. Colt brought in people who were geniuses that he collaborated with. Right? One of them was Walker, right? The other one was, most notably, I think, probably greatest example of this would be Browning, right? As in the Browning submachine gun and the Browning machine guns and the Browning 50 caliber machine gun. Browning would collaborate with Colt on these incredible designs. And the 1911 is the penultimate handgun, if you want any kind of like, sort of modern Americana in this expressed in this fashion. A semi-automatic weapon means that you pull the trigger and one bullet fires. You release the trigger. You pull the trigger, another bullet fires. You release the trigger. You pull the trigger, another bullet fires. You release the trigger. See, that's a semi-automatic, okay? What makes it semi-automatic instead of manual is that you don't have to cock the hammer, right? And you don't have to rotate a barrel or something, you see? So even the revolvers before this were technically semi-automatics, but this is, the configuration of this is quite beautiful. I mean, the shells, the shell cartridges fly out the top, so you don't have to worry about that. The magazine, which slides into the handle, is in a, well, I should say the cartridge that slides into the handle is a magazine carrying X amount of bullets, right? And then you can carry an extra magazine, right? An extra clip, right? And you can actually drop the clip and then put another one in, you see? And has this been the standard for every single modern handgun after that, that isn't a revolver anyway? Everybody who was in World War II, I worked with a World War II veteran who was a bomber, I don't know, pilot, I think. And he, on a B-17, and he brought with me, he showed me his government issued from the Army, Colt 1911 45 caliber pistol, right? So if you get shot down or something and you're headed into God knows where with your parachute, you have your Colt 45, you see? Now here's something else that Colt was in partial development with Thompson, right? And this is called a Tommy gun, where the Thompson 1921 drum magazined, right? And this is like an early version of today, what would be called an assault rifle, you see? An assault rifle is kind of like this garbage can term of, you know, something that isn't quite a normal hunting rifle, you know, when it seems like it's there to be in close quarters shooting at people, which kind of like it is, right? What the Thompson the machine gun was designed for was that law enforcement was being outgunned by criminals, right? So the police forces issued an order for some kind of a design where you can shoot up the gangsters, which were becoming, you know, I guess, rampant in the 1920s, you know, these Bonnie and Clyde type of characters running by in these Ford Model A's, you know, and you had to shoot at them as they were driving down the street, you know, this kind of stuff from old movies, right? And the magazine is in that circular case, and that had, I think that held like 30 rounds or something like that at least, right? And we still have these talks today about, well, how many bullets does a person need in a magazine, right? If they're not actually law enforcement or they're not going into battle or something, right? Here's an advertisement for Colt Firearms. And so safety on the highways, you know, and suppose he had not arrived, you know, the cop, right, who looks like he's on a bicycle, by the way, you say, but he's the arm of law and order, right? So you've got Colt Firearms now, which are synonymous with, you know, giving firepower to the good guys, you see, for reliability, for having the, you know, trusted by law enforcement and the military, right? So you know it's going to be reliable. So by the time the 1950s rolled around, the weapons that had been issued to the United States military from World War II, which were, you know, extraordinary weapons for their day and all the rest of that, you wanted to have a kind of a handheld, relatively lightweight, kind of a kick-ass gun. And the design went out for this. And the answer came back as the M16. If you know anything about Vietnam, if you watch Vietnam movies or that sort of a thing, right? You had the early generation of M16s, right? Which were built by a great extent by Colt, you see. And they incorporated a lot of plastic parts, right? So you didn't have to have this big walnut gun stock or a barrel grip, you see what I mean? Because you didn't need the weight, right? You wanted to make it lighter. And it's kind of brings us into a new generation of weaponry. This gun was designed and was starting to be tested by, I would say, 1958, 59, right? So this gun literally is as old as I am. And the early ones were problematic. Now, this is a weapon of war, right? We heard the term a lot, the weapon of war, right? What makes the weapon of war a weapon of war is that it has a fully automatic feature, right? Remember I was showing you the Colt 1911 and I said it was a semi-automatic, right? The mechanism on a 1911 is semi-automatic, which means that you pull the trigger, one bullet fires. You release the trigger, you pull the trigger again, another bullet fires until you're out of bullets, right? A fully automatic gun means that it's a machine gun, right? Which means that in fully automatic mode, you pull the trigger, and as long as you're holding the trigger down, it continuously fires X amount of bullets per minute, right? You might imagine that you're going through quite a bit of bullets in that regard, right? And you can see you've got this curved magazine here going into it, right? And this is kind of like, we had to answer the Russians, the Russians had the Kalashnikov, right? And the famous Kalashnikov. And the Russians were very good at designing stuff like this. See, so here we have what you would look at and you would say, okay, well, these are real assault rifles, right? So this type of weapon actually came into the forefront in World War II, right? Around 1943, the Germans had actually invented a lighter weight, fully automatic handheld weapon, right? And then the Russians countered with their own lightweight machine gun weapon. And then we countered with our own lightweight machine gun weapon, right? So the legacy of these things go back to World War II, right? And we had these things called the grease gun, right? And they were these short barrel-like weapons. If you ever worked on a car and you're greasing something, it looks like a grease gun, right? That's why we called it the grease gun. And the Russians had theirs, right? The British had theirs. I think they were called the Sten gun, if I'm not mistaken. And then obviously the Germans had theirs, right? And there's where a whole generation of these weapons were developed. But this was supposed to be a more reliable, a lighter version, a higher rate of fire, more bullet capacity, this sort of thing. And they hit the market and went into production and started showing up, of course, in our troops' hands in Vietnam when we expanded the war out officially in 1964 after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, right? And our troops issued these things, and people hated them, because they were. I mean, if you imagined if you were in the military, let's say, for instance, you were a World War II veteran and you were still in the Army during Vietnam in 1964, somebody handed you one of these things, you would say, what are you kidding me? What is this, a toy? You were used to these more substantial steel or, wood-stocked weapons. And this thing was made out of plastic. And they disaffectionately called it M16. They called it the Mattel 16 because Mattel was a manufacturer of toys, if you're old enough to remember that, you see. And the early ones had a lot of problems. They would jam, they were hard to clean, they were hard to field strip, that sort of a thing. And they had to really make big improvements on these things. but they did. But take a look at this thing, and this is in our mind what it looks like to have a weapon of war, right? The M16, fully automatic fire, right? Because this is big part of our national discussion now, and all kinds of rhetoricizing one way or the other. Right, here's another gun that Colt manufactures, even later on now. This is a Colt Anaconda. This is a 44 Magnum, right? And, like I said, either you like this sort of thing or you don't. There's a certain, I don't know, a certain kind of mechanical beauty to them, a certain kind of almost sensuality, if you want. Like I said, I've never felt the need to purchase a handgun. I don't think that I ever will. It's just not something I'm hankering to do. But I can certainly appreciate, the beauty in a piece of machinery. Okay. Here's another piece, a short, small weapon that you could put in your purse or something like that, right? And it looks like a small version of a Colt 1911, really, which I'm sure is no mistake. It's a real feature of Colt having that branding. Now, Colt, had a lot of business problems. They went out of business. They went into business. They were bought out. They were merged. Right now, they're owned by a Czechoslovakian company, right? And they still are manufacturing guns, but mostly on the legacy of what they used to do, right? The legacy that if you want to have a gun, it's kind of like, gee, I wish I always had that old car that I couldn't afford when I was younger. And then now you're in your 60s and you have the extra money, you want to buy one. A lot of people will go out and they'll buy a Colt 1911, because that's what they always imagined. There's a lot of them on the market. There's all kinds of people selling them and dealers. It's an entire industry, a real piece of kind of like antique American kind of legacy, if you're into that. Like I said, a lot of people around here, certainly not where I grew up. I grew up in New York and was born in New York City, and I never remembered anyone owning a handgun. My older brother had handguns, but when he was a teenager, he actually in his late teens, he became an auxiliary police officer, and he had his first Smith & Wesson 357 Magnum. So I used to go to the range and shoot it with him and all the rest of that. And I, as a child, and there I learned a lot of gun safety rules. People were pretty serious about their gun safety. Pretty serious about their gun safety. And so, that's kind of the legacy I remember about this. And then, I shot rifles and handguns and things like that. But I think the biggest example from a cultural standpoint about a gun is that I had dated this woman when I was, I don't know, 19, I guess. I don't even remember, it's such a long time ago, right? But she was from the South. Like the deep South, right? Her father had moved up here for something on some job, and that's where I met her. And then she moved back. Her father moved back, and she went with him. And I went down there a couple of times to visit her, and I was a real, I stood out as this New York kid, down in, say, like rural Alabama, if you see what I mean. And that's like the last thing they needed down there was some guy from New York coming and taking one of their local girls, right? But the thing is that her cousin, right? I was, eating dinner with her family and her young cousin, right? Who must have been around, I don't know, 10 years old, 12 years old, something like that, right? He was like awkwardly trying to get to know this stranger, me, right? And he was like, they were all laughing at me, the kids, because he speaks funny, right? Which I guess I did. And so as a bonding exercise, this kid comes out with this box, right? And I remember this like it was yesterday. And good on him for being such a good little guy, right? He wanted to find something that was in common with this stranger from a different planet, right? This guy from New York. And so he's going to bond with me with something that all men can agree on, a gun, right? So he brings out this box and he opens it up. And it was like, I don't know, it was like a 38 revolver, if I recall, right? And this was a gun that he, as a rite of passage as a young man, was given by his father. And he, with the most loving care, you know, and total gun safety, showed me this weapon. And he asked me, what kind of gun do I have? And when I told him that, well, I don't have a gun, right? As a grown man, to him, I was, at least as a 19-year-old. I mean, it completely knocked him completely back on his heels. It's like, what kind of guy who's 19 years old doesn't have his own gun, or at least several guns by now? You see, so that's the first time I really realized this massive difference in culture between one part of the world and another part of the world, and what is considered normal and what is not considered normal. And that's a very important lesson for me. I learned all the way back in those days, you know. I wonder whatever happened to that kid. It's probably a senator or something by now. Right, here's another advertisement, you know, Colt's patent repeating pistols. So here's where we get into a little bit of trouble, right? Remember the M16 that I showed you? Take a look at that. Remember, that's a fully automatic weapon. It's a machine gun. So manufacturers in the late 1950s, actually into the 1960s, right? They start developing these guns for consumer use. And they're called AR-15s, right? Now, AR does not stand for assault rifle. AR stands for Armor-Like, which was the first company that designed one. And you can see well that the one here, the 1973 version manufactured by Colt, right? And it looks almost identical to an M16, you see? The truth of the matter is that despite the way this gun looks, it is nothing more than just another semi-automatic gun, right? So every other rifle that's a semi-automatic rifle, or any other handgun that you pull the trigger and one bullet comes out, and then you have to pull the bullet again and another bullet comes out. That's all this is. You see, the problem with the AR series is that it looks like a weapon of war. It looks like an M16 in any configuration. You just can't get around it. I mean, it looks like, and apparently was intended to look like, an M16, right? And but the actual receiver casing here is really, you have certain features which are similar to the weapon of war, the M16, but it doesn't make it an M16. It's just a semi-automatic rifle, you see. Now, and this is where we get into trouble with these things, you see, and it's like I'm on the Merritt Parkway all the time, driving all over the place, right? And I've got these guys to the left of me and the guys to the right of me on the Merritt Parkway, and they are driving a Honda Civic. And except this Honda Civic has been lowered, so it's only like 1.5 inches off the ground, and it's got these big giant rims and tires on it, and the windows are all black, and it's got a giant muffler, and the guy put a big, like a wing on the back, right, on the trunk, you see. So is this person likely to drive more aggressively? Well, I would say that it probably would, right? Why else would he have emulated all of that kind of like race car type stuff on his Honda Civic, you see? So the likelihood, I mean, if this person was of the mind to do something stupid with a car, right, stereotypically, you would have to say it was probably going to be this guy. The guy with all of this tricked out stuff on his Honda Civic. Now, the thing is that it's just a Honda Civic, you see? And maybe that car really can only go 90 miles an hour on a good day, right? He's just, but in his mind, he's driving a Ferrari, you see? Now, the thing is, right, and I speak to you as a licensed counselor, right, as a licensed clinical social worker with his own private practice, psychotherapy. The problem with the AR-15, you can imagine, or unfortunately, we don't have to imagine, is that for if you spent in your testosterone raging years being unsupervised in your mom's basement, watching violent video games, and you've probably in a vicarious fashion on your video game already killed 1,000 people, in your mind, this is what you would be using to kill those 1,000 people, you see? So in the same way that this is just a semi-automatic weapon, like any other semi-automatic weapon, no matter how boring it would look, this one doesn't look boring. This one looks like an M16, you see? And you can't get around that. You know, so the question of whether or not you shouldn't have AR-style weapons because they're weapons of war. Well, they're not weapons of war, but they look just like weapons of war. And that does whatever it does to people who fantasize that they want to be Rambo. You see, this is a psychological thing. All right, does anybody need one of these things? Beats the hell out of me. I don't need one. But that is the thing. Right? You know, so here's the receiver assembly, right? And lightweight AR, you know, and there are many, many different brands of these now, right? And these companies now, you know, whether or not Remington should be sued or Colt should be sued because they manufacture these things, you know what I mean? So, you know, this is one of the topics of our time, and I can't really talk about Colt, you know, without talking a little bit about this. You know, the idea is like you don't need a magazine like that Thompson machine gun where you've got 30 rounds in one magazine. I mean, I don't see why anybody needs that. You know what I mean? So, you know, so if you can have 10 shots in one, then, you know, I mean, 10 shot isn't enough to shoot at a target. I don't see why you would need more than that, but that's just my opinion, you see? But it's a semi-automatic gun. One pull, one bullet. One pull, one bullet. One pull, one bullet. Just like the revolvers they were making in 1880. One pull, one bullet. Here is a memorial for one Samuel Colt at Cedar Hill Cemetery in Hartford. I've never been there. I've never seen this. And Colt is synonymous with, you know, the Wild West, which is another thing in our culture today. I talk about, you know, history like this all the time. And you can't talk about, like, when I was, I don't know, when I was a kid and I inherited my older brother's gun belt, you know, with the cap gun and all the rest of that. It was pretty much unquestioned that the people who went west, you know, the Americans of, you know, European descent who went west were nothing less than brave, you know, fighting these, you know, these scary Indians. Right now, of course, in the year 2022, it's the Americans who went west were genocidal, and we had taken away land that wasn't ours, and we were committing war atrocities, right? By the treatment of native peoples, etc. You see, but anyway, here's revolver, Sam Colt, and the 6-shooter that changed America, right? So like it or not, good or bad, you know, the Colt revolver and those like the Colt revolver were iconic. You know, if you ever saw that famous scene where Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, You know, they're running around and they're about to get shot up by the, I guess it's the Bolivian army. You're right. Those were Colt revolvers in their hands, you see. So, you know, you can see the kind of appeal and the kind of legacy that this sort of thing might have. Here's another publication, right? The Revolver of the American West. You know, oftentimes these guns were heavily adorned with all sorts of scroll work, etc. You know, this one is, you can see, it's seen a little bit of pitting, etc., as something made out of metal might have been from so long ago. You know, but it's like when I was a machinist and getting trained as a machinist, they brought us to these, the school brought us to these manufacturing centers, and still sent many of them in 1970. There were still a few of them around. I remember one, this Moore Machine Tool Company, and the guy who started the company was like a Samuel Colt kind of a guy, you know, and he designed this big milling machine that could do all of these precise things, and that's what we were there to see. And then you have these old-time craftsmen sitting in the corner doing this hand engraving on different pieces of machinery. And to me, it was the epitome of workmanship, craftsmanship, blacksmithing, you know, and just it's part of my own personal legacy and something that I understand, something I even love, you see. Not to say that I love guns. I love the machinery of it. You know, I love the feel of it. I can appreciate the precision machine of it, and kind of like the pride that went behind the engraving of it. You see, if I'm trying to carefully separate those two things for you to show that one does not equate the other, right? Anybody recognize this? If you lived in Bridgeport, you would recognize it. This is the Remington Shot Tower, right? So not only Colt, but a legacy of many other gun makers, right? From New England, but especially from Connecticut, had actually had their innovation and manufacturing right here locally, relatively locally. Now, where the shot tower is, the Remington Shot Tower, here it is, and is degraded condition. I don't even know if it's still standing. It ought to still be standing. I think that I heard they were going to restore it as an artifact or something. But, you know, Remington, like many other companies, is being chased around with lawsuits and things like that, and being invited to southern states down in like Georgia. I think that Remington's going to Georgia. And the shot tower was, you take molten metal and you go all the way to the top of the shot tower, and they actually drop these carefully portioned measures of lead, I guess it was, and it would drop. And then by the time it dropped, it was a perfect circle, if I understand this correctly. And then it would hit a cooling tank. And that's how they make the little tiny pieces of shot that go into shotgun shells, you see. They would literally drop it from the top of the tower, you know, en masse, and it would all go down, and it would be these perfect little cylinders by the time it got to the bottom of the shot tower. That's why it's called the shot tower, you see. I hope you found that interesting. And but, you know, but now this sort of legacy as well of the infrastructure of industry in general, oftentimes here where we live, is we live in a post-industrial society. And of course, the Onion Dome, as far as I know, is still there, visible from probably the highway, you know, right there in Hartford. I mean, that's a pretty distinctive thing. The Colt collection, I think they gave it to the state of Connecticut. It was either the state of Connecticut or a historical society or something like that. But, you know, Colt had all of these legacy weapons that they had, like the first model of and all the rest of that. And for those who were interested in that, they're not hard to find. And here's, speaking of legacy weapons, I mean, this is it. This is the one, right? the iconic Colt 1911. And if you want a legacy gun, it's probably going to be something like this, 45 caliber, and it packs a pretty big wallop, right? And it's I don't know, people who want stuff that reminds them of what they were impressed with as a young person, this would be your gun. You know, it's a beautiful weapon. It is tried, it's proven. In many times it's unimproved upon. You know, they have more modern weapons out today that are lighter, right? I don't know if you've ever shot a gun or shot a 45 for that matter. You know, it's kind of like, you know, I've shot in ranges. You know, last time I was there was only a couple of months ago. I went with my brother, actually, who brought a couple of his guns. And he actually has one of these things. You know, it's like a little cannon, you know. But if you can put, I don't know, 7 or 8 rounds in a tight cluster, right, at 50 feet, right, especially with my eyesight being what it is today, I don't dislike it. I don't dislike it. Like I said to you, I don't feel the need to go and buy a gun or have a gun or carry a gun with me, but I like a certain level of skill set or sportsmanship. Here's a quote by somebody called Matthew Quigley, right? And this kind of became a famous thing that stuck to Colt enthusiasts. God created all men. Sam Colt made them equal, right? Right, being the firearm, of course, the great equalizer, right? So I wonder what Sam Colt would say about all of this today. You know, he won and he lost, this guy. He was down and out a lot of times. When he died, he actually left his wife a lot of money, you know, but the guy he was smart, but he wasn't so smart. He made a lot of bad decisions and he spent a lot of money, and his corporate people were always complaining to him that he was spending too lavishly. And he would take guns and he would have them emblazoned with all of this plating and engraving and all of the rest of this, and he would give it to some head of state in some foreign place that nobody ever heard of, hoping that that would impress them and they would buy 1,000 of them, which they never did. You know, so he's like a lot of people. You know, did a program just recently on General Grant, then president, as he became president. And, you know, Grant had a terrible reputation as a president, not because he was particularly unintelligent or something. It's just that he trusted too many people who weren't good at what they were doing, and they took advantage of their position and they took advantage of him. You know, so it seems like history is filled with people who, even though they're determined, even though they're hardworking, even though they're very intelligent, even though they're particularly skilled at a certain thing, they are prone to their own personal foibles and misjudgments. And I think that Samuel Colt fit into that category. His country was bought up and sold 12 times after the time he was dead, and a few times when he was alive. You know, it bears a shadow of its former history of innovation and quality. You know, it's really just kind of like a corporate name now. That is, people are seeing what they can make out of it as far as profit. There's a lot of those stories around. Here's my last slide for you. I'll go out of screen share. And I didn't look in the chat room. 5 questions. Appreciate your comments about the micrometer and matching precision. Reminds me of my own micrometers, run out gauges, and lathe. The smell of oil and smoking cutting oil. There you go. You either know what I'm talking about here or you don't. You know, is the Colt Army in West Hartford still standing? I think it is. Okay, I think it is. You know what? I have half a mind to get in the car and drive up there and see. You know, it ain't that far, is it? I knew Marty Sagendorf, a designer for more specialty tools. He helped me with some machining I met old man Moore. It was unbelievable, right? Oh, the old Colt building was made into apartments. There you go. I guess I hope the Onion Dome must still be standing though. I'll bet you it is, right? And yeah, anyway, so what I wanted to do today is I wanted to give you a history of Sam Colt and the industry in Connecticut as it pertains to firearms. But essentially what I also wanted to do is to impart on you the kind of what might seem irrational to some love of these little machines, right? And I used it, I hope I wasn't too ham-fisted about it by trying to show you the way I grew up with something that's probably as close to gunsmithing as you can get, which is locksmithing, right? And that I only felt at home in places where they were these quiet men who were sitting in a corner just doing something with their skill that they were never going to get credit for or anything else like that, but they were phenomenally disciplined and skilled at what they were doing, and our built world is largely dependent, if not directly, but at least on the legacy of just such people. Thank you so much for joining me today. It was my privilege being with you.
Thank you very much, Art.
You're quite welcome.
Alrighty.
I will see you soon for our next presentation.
Yes, on the 20th. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye, everyone.